We often talk about immersion as if it was a purely visual problem. Better lighting, more detailed textures, more polygons, or more particles. But good visuals alone don't create immersion. At best, they create something nice to look at. Immersion happens when what you see, what you hear, and what you do all support the same feeling, moment after moment. In the Ember Guardian, immersion has always been one of my main goals. Not in the sense of realism, but in the sense of presence. I want the player to feel like they exist inside the world, to understand it, and to react to it instinctively. And that doesn't come from graphics alone. It comes from how creatures behave when you approach them, from how the world sounds when you walk through it, from how the weather changes, how the day fades into night, and how the game communicates danger, safety, or tension without explicitly telling you. In this video, I want to break down how I approached immersion in the Ember Guardian by building a world that feels alive through the combination of sound, visuals, and gameplay, instead of chasing perfect visual fidelity, which is not really achievable at a solo developer scale. I'll show how almost invisible small details end up doing all the work when they're layered together. Exploration in the Ember Guardian is at the heart of gameplay. You can't survive without venturing into the world. That's where you gather resources to survive each night, and it's also where immersion has to do most of the work, because it's where the player spends the most uninterrupted time inside the world. Let's start with the creatures. Each biome has its own set of enemies, carefully chosen to fit the atmosphere. I'm using an asset collection for this game, and I had to recolor a few creatures to adapt them to their biome. For example, certain bugs that were originally more in a poisonous vibe were swapped to whitish, bluish tones to fit the gloomy vibe of the Lumen Hollow. The game is visually dark, and so are most of the creatures, so I had to find a way to make them visible to the player. That's where I started fiddling with glowing objects, and thankfully this look was perfectly fitting for the game's setting. The Ember Guardian is set in a futuristic post-apocalyptic world, which is perfect for glowing neons and lasers, mixed with dark fantasy elements. Blue glows tend to indicate resources. Deers have luminous antlers, rats and foxes have glowing tails, and mines have glowing runes on them, subtly guiding the player's attention while fitting the game's atmosphere. And for enemy creatures, I could make parts of them glow in red, either to fit the futuristic setting of the game with mechanical creatures, or fit its dark fantasy setting, like with the glowing red eyes of the ghouls. All of this helps the player read the world visually. If you're curious to see how it feels to move inside this world and discover it at your own pace, you can wishlist the Ember Guardian in the description below. A free demo is also available on Steam, so feel free to try it out. But reading the world and feeling it are very different things. Visuals alone aren't enough to create immersion. And that's where sound comes in. For instance, each creature has a full set of sounds for each situation. Idle, grunts and groans when they haven't spotted you, giving subtle cues of danger. Footsteps. Tiny footsteps for tiny creatures can sound cute, but when you hear 100 of them, it becomes oppressing. Needless to say, huge footsteps accompanied with green shakes are pretty dreadful. Aggro. Screams or alert when they notice you. Something supposed to alert the player, danger is coming. Attacks. With some creatures having a different sound when they actually hit you, like a little laugh for these goblin-like creatures. Death, reinforcing their identity. And bullet impacts. I'm using different sounds for flesh or mechanical enemies, as well as critical hits, bouncing bullets, hitting shields. All of this giving satisfying feedback and information for each shot. All these sound sets really help setting apart the different creatures. Layered together, they constantly inform the player. Beautiful props also play a huge role in immersion, and I made sure to carefully rework the assets to make them fit the universe perfectly. For example, these street signs looked pretty basic in the sprite sheet. I split them up into the panel and the glowing inscriptions, added a subtle glow effect to the letters, animated it, applied a small spark particle effect, and added a small sound effect. Just like that, a simple sign suddenly felt like a post-apocalyptic artifact. Another example, these light poles were fine as is, but adding a flickering light, animating it, and pairing it with a flickering sound turned them into props that really reinforced the atmosphere. Particles are another huge part of the game's visual identity and help the world feel alive. When you start noticing them, you'll realize they are everywhere. Some particles constantly run in the background to give depth to the environment. Others act as props themselves, little insect clouds placed near light sources or vegetation, or fireflies that appear when you walk over vegetation, but only at dawn or dusk. Most of these effects are barely noticeable on their own, but they constantly reinforce the idea that the world exists independently from the player. We mentioned fireflies, but those aren't the only props that react to the player. Early in development, I came across a pixel art vegetation shader I knew I couldn't live without. It brings life to vegetation in two ways, mimicking swaying of the wind or reacting to external forces, like the player or a creature running over them. It was very challenging to set up, the shader wasn't adapted to my Unity version, and each vegetation prop had to be manually reworked to split the moving parts, like the leaves, from the static parts, like the trunk. But the result is pretty incredible in my opinion. That sense of physical reaction, even subtle, goes a long way in making the world feel tangible. I'll link a video covering the shader in more detail as I think it really deserves more visibility. Wind is one of the 3 weather conditions I added to the game, along with fog and rain. They all work slightly differently. Fog is purely visual. It gives a mystic vibe to the environment by reinforcing lighting effects like the player's torch. I had to deal with the fact that near the fire, the fog looked weird. So basically when lighting a fire, the fog fades out, and moving away from the fire during exploration slowly makes the fog fade in. Here, visuals do most of the work. Sound stays intentionally minimal. Rain is purely visual too. It comes in 4 intensities: calm, mild, strong, and extreme, each one handing a different vibe. One fun detail about rain, I'm basically using 2 particle effects. The first one is on a layer in front of everything and doesn't have any interaction with objects. The second one has interactions with surfaces, and when a raindrop hits a surface, it's destroyed and generates a smaller particle effect, representing the drop bouncing and splitting into smaller drops. For the front layer, drops are just destroyed randomly somewhere in the body of water. And this is where shader magic comes in. The water actually has a parameter allowing me to simulate water drops falling into it. The result of all that is a beautiful and immersive rain effect that triggers randomly at dawn in some levels, making some atmospheres almost feel cozy with a very subtle rain, or on the opposite, much more oppressive when the rain is extreme. And of course, it wouldn't feel as good without their own respective sound effects. Rain works because it's both seen and heard, and the sound is what really sells its intensity, far more than the visuals alone. Wind has the same 4 intensities and was tricky to make look natural. I'm using 2 layers of fog and a particle system to simulate the air movement, and this is where the vegetation shader shines most. You can adjust a parameter to simulate higher wind strengths, and this controls how much the leaves sway. Wind is also the only weather element that actually affects gameplay. Each morning, a random direction is chosen, either pushing or slowing the player depending on where they're heading. It adds an extra layer of strategy to exploration. I also considered giving rain an extra gameplay effect, like increasing fire consumption, but it felt too punishing without a positive counterbalance. Sound design for wind though, like for rain, adds a ton to the overall atmosphere, with soft winds feeling almost cozy and strong winds making you feel impatient for dusk and the calm it brings. Wind is where visuals, sound, and gameplay all intersect. Silence is a design choice, and in the Ember Guardian, it's what allows sound effect to carry most of the immersion. The game is deliberately sparse in music, perfect for the post-apocalyptic vibe. But music is also incredibly powerful to highlight key moments. Exploration tracks, for example, trigger during long excursions to make them feel epic. But how do you know when a player is heading out to explore or when he's just checking on something real close to the camp? Well, I'm using a series of conditions to decide when to play an exploration track. First, it should be early at dawn. I don't want music starting if it'll stop moments later at dusk. Secondly, the player should be heading out with enough health and ammo to survive a proper exploration session. Finally, I don't trigger music immediately when these conditions align. Instead, I'm just increasing a counter, and when this counter reaches a certain value, I trigger the music. In my opinion, this scarcity makes each track feel more impactful. They are here to mark moments. Some moments, however, deserve to be treated differently. And that's where music become irreplaceable. There's another category I call environment discovery tracks, which trigger when you discover a new biome. Since they trigger only once in the game, these tracks create a sense of wonder and make these discovery moments truly memorable. These tracks were composed by two artists who perfectly captured the game's atmosphere. Their work blends acoustic instruments, fitting the game's post-apocalyptic side of the lore, with electronic textures that reflect the game's futuristic setting. The main menu track is built around a strong, memorable melody meant to immediately set the tone of the game, while the hub track is more subtle. Rusty, worn-out guitar sounds, designed to create a calming and shopping atmosphere between levels, when the player can breathe and spend those hard-earned gems. The exploration tracks lean much more toward electronic sounds. Each one has its own identity, allowing to convey different emotions during exploration. Level discovery tracks, on the other hand, are fully tailored to their biome, reinforcing the feeling that you're stepping into a new and unexplored place for the first time. Overall, I'm extremely happy with how the music support both the world and the gameplay. Working with these composers was an absolute pleasure, and I'll link their portfolios in the description if you're interested. Music is also tightly linked to the day and night cycle. Exploration tracks always stop at dusk, helping to create this sense of calm before the storm, while the night uses an evolving combat track. To understand why this matters so much for immersion, I have to go into more detail about how the day-night cycle works. A full day in the Ember Guardian is split into 4 distinct phases, each with a clear gameplay role: dawn, day, dusk, and night. Dawn happens right after you've successfully defended your camp against a night attack. This is where you mostly repair your defenses and get ready to head out. Some players also use this time to start preparing for the next night. Day is where exploration mostly takes place. Dusk is usually the moment you realize it's time to head back. And night is fully dedicated for combat and defense. Each phase has a clear role, both mechanically and emotionally. Even though of course some days can play out a little different, this structure generally stays true. Splitting the day-night cycle into 4 distinct phases really helped the players plan out their actions. So making a transition from one phase to the next one feel noticeable is extremely important. Visually first, a lot changes during a transition. The sky and the sun's color change over time, and global lighting changes as well, both in terms of intensity and color. But visuals alone wouldn't be enough to clearly communicate on those shifts. Sound also helps truly anchor the player in time. Each phase transition has its own dedicated sound cue. Dawn features early birds chirping. Day brings in insect sounds like crickets. Dusk is marked by a distant howl. And night plays a soft, unsettling wind. As I mentioned before, music always stops at dusk, reinforcing the urge to go home. Weather conditions can also amplify these transitions, making them feel even more drastic, especially when strong wind or rain suddenly stops. At night, music stops being atmospheric. It becomes reactive. I split it into multiple loops of increasing intensity, and depending on the state of the camp, a different loop is played. For example, if a few creatures breach your barricades, the music ramps up. And if enemies damage the fire and more are still within the camp, then the highest intensity kicks in. It's not a perfect system. I think I could have done better in terms of switching from one loop to another, and here I'm basically waiting for a loop to be over before playing the next one. However, even with this unperfect system, I think it does a pretty good job at reinforcing the feeling that the world is responding to your situation in real time. Combat is where sound design matters the most, because it's what the player constantly experiences. So I gave combat sounds particular attention during development. Weapon designs follow a futuristic neon glow direction. Visually, these neon elements convey critical information like how much ammo you still have in your magazine. Each weapon also comes with its set of sound effects: shooting, cooldown, out of ammo cues, and reloading. All these sounds are essential to give each weapon a strong and unique identity. To illustrate this, let me show you what happens if I take the sound effects from the rifle and apply them to the assault rifle. And now if I use the dedicated assault rifle sound effect, when shooting the magazine's last bullet, the gunshot's pitch is tweaked a little higher and slightly accelerated, hinting the player on the fact that he just emptied his weapon and he should reload. One last word specifically about shooting sounds. A weapon can look powerful, but it's the sound that make it feel powerful. With the screen shake feedback, of course. I spent a lot of time scrolling through my sound effect library looking for good futuristic gunshots, but I was never completely satisfied. They fit the setting, but most of them lacked punch. And modern firearm sound effects didn't really quite fit the setting either. So I decided to mix modern and futuristic sound effects. The modern layer provides impact and weight, while the futuristic layer grounds the sound in the game's universe. The same goes in general for reloading sounds, which I created assembling bits and pieces of modern and futuristic sounds. In my opinion, the result's pretty good, each weapon feels pretty satisfying to use, and most importantly, it really helps in creating a unique setting. When working on the Ember Guardian, I realized that what really makes the world feel alive is how visual, sound, and mechanics all work together. Sound can often be an overlooked aspect of game development, but in my opinion, sound isn't here to decorate the experience. It informs, it warms, it helps setting the rhythm of the day. Sometimes it reinforces the visuals, sometimes it replaces them completely. And sometimes, silence does more than any track would. Throughout development, I stopped thinking of sound as something added after the visuals. Instead, it became an equal part of the world-building process. Something designed along environments, systems, and gameplay. And I think that's what ultimately makes the Ember Guardian feel coherent, because all the elements pull in the same direction. I also have a problem with early polishing my games. I can't help but do it, so maybe I'm just making up excuses. That's what this video was about, showing how all these small pieces are built, even though most players won't consciously notice them. As a developer, that can be frustrating. A lot of work goes completely unseen, and if you yourself are a developer, I guess you've already experienced the moment where you show a piece of gameplay to a relative or a friend, and they're like, yeah, this looks good, without realizing how much work you've put into that, and how important it is for them to really overreact. So yeah, in the end, good immersion, or like good gameplay in general, isn't about what players notice consciously. It's mostly about what they feel without even realizing why. And reading positive reviews on the demo really warms my heart, because that's when I realized I think I've successfully created a coherent universe out of almost nothing. The game hits Steam next week on April 17th, and I'm super excited. If you want to experience this world yourself and see how it plays out, you can wishlist the Ember Guardian in the description below. It's really the best way you can support me at this point. You can also play the free demo. It's actually the beginning of the game, and your save will be carried on to the full game if you're into it. So that's another option. Anyways, thanks for watching, and keep an eye out for more videos.